Hi, I'm Nikki and this is Paul here from Clear Spring Church, Gloucester. You may have seen us before on here. We love coming on this show to discuss new topics with you, and today we're going to be discussing the book of Revelation. What's better than the book of Revelation, the unveiling of Christ's plans? And today we're going to discuss what the importance of the book of Revelation is in our day and age now and what it means to us and the church. Okay, so Paul, first question then is, what is the purpose of the book of Revelation and who is its intended audience?
Well, the book of Revelation is a very, very important book for the church to understand because it describes what's going to happen in the future in a period of time known as the day of the Lord. That's what the Old Testament prophets used to call it. As Christians, we call it the tribulation period. And the day of the Lord, or the tribulation period, is a period in the future, hasn't happened yet. It's a 7-year period in the future when God will pour out his wrath and judgment upon the earth and the inhabitants of the earth for 7 years. It's also during this time that we will see the rise of the Antichrist and the false prophet. And also in the culmination of these days, we will see the second coming of Jesus Christ to the earth. So the book of Revelation is very, very important. And if we're to understand the book of Revelation, we can understand the book of Revelation in 4 sections or 4 compartments. And I would place within the first compartment the 7 churches, or the church age. The second compartment I would call the day of the Lord, or the tribulation period. This is the part of Revelation where it describes the outpouring of God's wrath upon the earth. The third compartment we could look at is the Messianic age, or the Messianic kingdom, which lasts for about 1,000 years on earth of Christ ruling and reigning. And the fourth compartment or section we could call the eternal order. And this is where God will dwell on the new heavens and the new earth with believers like yourself and myself.
I think that's a very good way of breaking it down, because a lot of people, when you speak to them about the book of Revelation, some people just think, oh, it's so complicated. I don't really know, where do we even start? There's so many symbols and things in there that, oh, what does that mean? What does this mean? And when does that happen? What period of time, etc. But yeah, breaking it down, like you said, into the church age, the day of the Lord, the Messianic kingdom and the eternal order makes things so much easier.
And it seems to be written in a chronological sequence as well. And I would say 90 to 95% of the imagery and symbology used in Revelation is already used elsewhere in the scriptures, especially the Old Testament prophets. And where it's not used, it's described by the Apostle John. So the book of Revelation is a little bit tricky to start with, but once you understand the Old Testament prophets, and what they were foreseeing, what they were predicting through the power of the Holy Spirit, then the book of Revelation kind of makes sense. I mean, it's a chronological sequence of God's plan for the ages, the church age, the day of the Lord, the Messianic kingdom, followed by the eternal order. It's written in a chronological sequence by the Apostle John. And what John is trying to do is take all of those Old Testament prophecies about the coming day of the Lord, and he puts them into a sequence that the readers of his letter or of his book can understand. So we can know exactly what's going to happen in the future, because it's been given to us by Jesus through John and in a chronological order, so we can know exactly what's going to happen and who wins in the end.
Yeah, exactly, which is extremely important, isn't it?
It's good news.
Extremely important. And I was just thinking, so when he speaks to these 7 churches, can we apply that to ourselves then in our churches right now?
We can, but what's really interesting about the 7 churches of Asia Minor, which we'd call modern-day Turkey, is that the definite article is used here. Jesus, through John, is writing to the 7 churches. But there's a problem with that. There were way more than 7 churches in Asia Minor. So when you see the number 7 being used, it's representing wholeness or completion. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the very first book of the Bible, it begins with 7 days. And the very last book of the Bible begins with 7 churches. And when you study each of the 7 churches, each of their names holds something in particular, something of value, like Laodicea, for instance, the final 7th church. It means people ruling. Or Philadelphia, it means brotherly love. So each church name has a specific meaning and context. And when you read the letter addressed to that church, the contents of that letter is in keeping with the name. So, for instance, Smyrna comes from the word myrrh. Myrrh is associated with death. And when you read the letter to Smyrna, it's all about those Christians who are facing martyrdom, who are facing death. And so many theologians believe that, yes, these were 7 literal churches, but more than that, they're prophetic symbols of the church age, that the church age will go through 7 specific steps leading up to the final church age, which is the Laodicean age, an age of an unsaved church.
Because he calls it the lukewarm church, doesn't he? He says, you become lukewarm, and in that respect, I wanted to spew you out of my mouth.
Well, it's a wealthy church. It's a church focused on financial and material gain. And he says the one thing they lack are white garments. And throughout the book of Revelation, white garments are a symbol of salvation.
Yeah.
And it's no wonder then that Christ is outside of this church, knocking and wanting to come in. So it's a visible church, it's a physical church, but it's a church without Christ. And I believe that we are currently in this age, and as time moves forward and as we draw closer and closer to the day of the Lord, the church will become more and more secular and less Christ-centric.
So it is like a warning then, isn't it, to the churches of this day and age?
Yes.
And it's telling us, look, this isn't the way to go. And if Christ is on the outside knocking in, that's not good. We want him to be in the centre of the church, don't we? So, yeah, like the Philadelphia, was it the Philadelphia church that was, he didn't, you know.
He has nothing bad to say about the brotherly love church.
Yeah,
Why? Because they are, they're not looking inwardly, they're looking outwardly. They're making most of every opportunity that Christ gives them. They're an evangelical church, they're a gospel preaching church, they're a church of love, and they're motivated by love. But you come to the next church, Laodicea, it's a church that's motivated by greed and wealth and materialism. And so we must be very careful that we, as individual fellowships, that we are a Philadelphia type church and not a Laodicean church. Laodicea means people ruling as opposed to Christ ruling.
Very good. Okay, let's move on then, because I think we could go on and on about that for a while, actually. It's very interesting, but we're going to move on to the next question. What is the significance of the opening of the 7 seals and the blowing of the 7 trumpets and the bowl judgments in the book of Revelation?
That's a great question. In the Old Testament prophets foresaw a day, and it was known as the day of Yahweh, or the day of the Lord. And it was a time in the future when the God of Israel would bring justice to Israel and would punish the Gentile nations for their treatment of the Jewish people. And many of the Old Testament prophets foresee the day of the Lord or the tribulation. When we come to the book of Revelation, we come to chapter 6, we see that Christ is the only one who is able to break the seals of the scroll which contains the judgments. And the principle is this: he who is without sin can cast the first stone. And the only person who is found or discovered worthy to judge the inhabitants of the whole earth is Christ, because Christ overcame the world. He wasn't he didn't fall into temptation or sin under the control of Satan. He overcame the flesh, he overcame the world, and he overcame the evil one. Therefore, only Christ has the authority, and only Christ is worthy to break the seals. And what we see with the seal judgments is, with each breaking of the seal, a judgment from God is delivered upon the earth. And when we get to the 7th seal, within the 7th seal are the 7 trumpets. With the blowing of the 7th trumpet are the 7 bowls. And so what we see with the outpouring of the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, and the bowl judgments is an intensification of God's wrath and judgment upon an ungodly world. And he turns up the heat, so to speak, to give the inhabitants of the world one last chance to trust and believe in Jesus Christ before Christ comes to bring a close to the end of the age.
So just to get this straight, because I think this is one of the things and the deceptions that perhaps people get wrong sometimes. They think to themselves, that's got to be the wrath of Satan. But you think, how? Well, no, because biblically we know that there is judgment poured out on those that continue to live in sin and don't choose Christ. There's got to be some sort of judgment for that, isn't there? Like in everything in life these days, you've got to have...
I've heard it taught that only the bold judgments are the wrath of God, but that simply is not true according to Scripture. It's clear that Christ is the one, and only Christ is the one worthy to break the seals that contain all of the judgments of God. And so the Bible teaches that in these last days, it will be God who will bring a deception upon the world. And in the name of basically the Antichrist will be brought upon the world scene because God will give the world the leader they deserve. And so with the breaking of the first seal, we see the Antichrist rising to power. And we must remember, as you mentioned, it is the day of the Lord. It's not the day of Satan. And so with the Antichrist coming upon the world stage and Satan being let loose to do what he does, these are judgments from God. And so we must always understand that Christ is in full control of the tribulation period. And as you rightly said, it's not the day of Satan, it's not the day of the Antichrist, it is the day of Yahweh.
And interesting again, the fact that it's the 7 seals, that number 7 again, obviously representing completeness, completion and wholeness. So interesting how that's used a lot. And like we know, obviously number 6 referring to the to man. So yeah, very interesting, isn't it? Right, okay, let's move on to the next question. What is the meaning of the 4 horsemen in the first 4 seals of Revelation?
Great, so Christ breaks the first seal, and we see this rider on a white horse bent on conquest, wearing a Stephanos crown. That's a crown of a conqueror, the crown of an overcomer. And so this is what begins the tribulation period, this rider bent on conquest. And this is none other than the Antichrist himself. And once we see the Antichrist come on the world scene bent on conquest, what then follows, obviously with the 4 horsemen, is we see then war breaking out. This may potentially be the 3rd World War. There may be other wars or world wars in between, but this is a 3rd World War that the Antichrist will bring upon the planet, and it says that peace is removed from the whole earth. This will be the 3rd World War. Then, after the war is broken out, we will see scarcity and famine, and people will begin to die of this, and that's what the 4th horseman is, death. Death will ensue. And a great portion of the world's population will be wiped out with this 3rd World War that will be brought about by the Antichrist as he's trying to usurp authority over the 10 kings on the earth at that time and become the one world dictator.
And is there reference to this? Is it in Matthew 24 you said? There's so many sort of references to the book of Revelation in Matthew 24.
Yeah, when Jesus is delivering the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, basically what Jesus is doing is outlining the book of Revelation. And so Matthew 24 is pre-Revelation, okay? It's a condensed version of the book of Revelation. And so what we find in the book of Revelation, you'll see Jesus talking about in Matthew chapter 24. So Jesus in Matthew 24, when he's discussing the end times with his apostles and disciples, he says, you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. Don't be alarmed. These things must happen, but the end is still to come. So wars and rumors of wars are natural signs that will occur during the church age, and we're not to be concerned about them. But then he goes on to say, when you see nation rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, coupled with earthquakes and famines and pestilences, then this is the sign that the birth pangs to the end of the age has begun. Now, in Hebrew, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom is an idiom which means world war. And so basically what Jesus is teaching in Matthew 24 is when you see a world war coupled with famines, pestilences, and earthquakes, that's the sign that the end of the age has begun, and the generation who sees this will not pass away until all of these things have been completed. When you turn to Revelation chapter 6, with the breaking of the first seal, the Antichrist arises, a world war occurs, there are famines, there are death, and there's a mighty earthquake which strikes the earth. So the sign that Jesus warns about in Matthew 24 is fulfilled in Revelation 6. And those who are alive and they're on the earth at the beginning of the tribulation, that generation will not pass away until they see all of these things completed with the second coming of Jesus Christ.
Because some people could these days, when you hear about some of the earthquakes we've had recently, could start thinking, well, are we kind of in the beginning then of like tribulation? Or because
we are in the last days, no doubt. As soon as Israel are back in their homeland, and that happened on the 15th of May 1948, the last days, the countdown began. But what Jesus is speaking about in Matthew 24, in a sense, is the last of the last days.
Exactly.
When you see the Antichrist rising to power, the world war occur with pestilences and famines and earthquakes, and the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, that is the sign that the end of the age really has begun, and the birth pangs will now increase, or the contractions of wrath or justice outpoured by Jesus will now increase until that results in the second coming.
So there's a lot more that needs to happen first, isn't there, before all of these things can start and before tribulation starts, for people to see. Whether, you know, people start panicking now and sort of seeing these little mini earthquakes and things, we need to have this world war first, and a lot of other things before, like you say, that are set in place before that can happen. Yeah,
there have always been wars. Since Cain killed Abel,
and that could go on for a long time, couldn't it? It could go on for a very long time before that happens.
So there'll be lots of wars, lots of earthquakes. But as we draw closer to the day of the Lord, these things will begin to intensify and increase.
Okay.
And then Matthew 24 then will be fulfilled with in Revelation 6 with the rising up of the Antichrist. We'll begin to see Revelation being poured out then, that wrath of God.
Okay, great. I think that's the answer to that. Okay, next question. What is the significance of the number 666 and the symbol of the beast in the book of Revelation?
So when we come to Revelation midway through, 3.5 years into the day of the Lord, remember the day of the Lord is a 7-year period. When we get halfway through, the Antichrist has finally arisen to power, and he's taken control of most of the world. There are a few kingdoms he's not taken control of, but most of the world will now be under his control and authority. When he arises to power, the temple in Jerusalem will have already been built, and he will deify himself. He will proclaim himself to be God, and he will sit himself in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God, according to the Apostle Paul. At this point, his right-hand man, who the Bible talks about as the false prophet, who's able to perform lying signs, wonders, and counterfeit miracles. He will create an image of the Antichrist, which is called the abomination of desolation. And this will be given the breath of life. So it will come to life. It may be what we're seeing in AI right now. It may be a development of that in the future. It may not be, it may be something else, but there will be this idol that comes to life, and it will force the inhabitants of planet Earth to receive a mark, and this mark will be the Antichrist's name, which in Hebrew adds up to 666. As many of our viewers will know, the Hebrew alphabet has numerical value added to each of the letters. So Aleph equals 1, Bet equals 2, Gamel equals 3, Dalet equals 4, so on and so forth, all the way through the Hebrew alphabet. And when you add up the Antichrist's name in the Hebrew tongue, in the Hebrew language, his name will add up to 666. And therefore, those who own the Antichrist as God and as their Lord and as their King, they will receive the mark of his name. So they'll receive something like a tattoo or an engraving of the Antichrist's name, either upon their forehead or on the back of their hand. And this will show that the Antichrist owns these people.
So just to confirm as well, this happens halfway through the tribulation, that they will receive this mark, all of those that conform to the beast. Because some people have been worried in the past about some of these things you hear on the media that are coming out, these little chips that they might be inserting into people for whatever it is. Oh, that might be the mark of the beast, that might be the mark of the beast. But we will know about it if that was the case. We would truly, it wouldn't be like guessing work about it. It wouldn't be like, oh, that could possibly be this, and then start worrying about it. We will definitely know about it because it says it's specifically halfway through the tribulation, the day of the Lord.
Yeah, and Christians have been worrying about this mark of the beast for a long, long time. We must understand that only those who reject Christ and worship the Antichrist will receive the mark of the beast.
They know what they're doing. They know it wouldn't be something like, oh, they put that in me and I didn't know about it. And exactly.
It's a sign of ownership.
Yes.
And only those who love and worship the Antichrist as God will receive it. So, you know, since there has been the invention of ink, people have declared things to be the mark of the beast, or some people will say that Sunday worshippers, that's the mark of the beast, which I think is crazy.
Wow.
Yeah, or some people have taught that. Other people have taught that credit cards were the mark of the beast, or the chip and pin within your debit card is the mark of the beast, or certain vaccines are the mark of the beast. None of these things at all are the mark of the beast. As you rightly said, the Antichrist rises to power over a 3.5-year period when he finally reaches that position of world emperor. It's at that point when he controls the vast majority of the countries of planet Earth that people will be forced to receive the mark at that time. So anything prior to that simply cannot be the mark of the beast, biblically speaking.
So we'd know about it. And also, I suppose there's that thing of the rapture coming beforehand as well, because we believe that we're going to be raptured before the tribulation, because we shouldn't be appointed to God's wrath, surely, as his people.
Sure. There are varying views on when the rapture is going to occur, but I think biblically speaking, when you accumulate all of the evidence as to when Christ will come for his bride, it seems clear that the church is not appointed unto God's wrath, and that's why it's important to understand that the day of the Lord is God's wrath. It's not Satan's wrath.
Yeah.
And that Christ will come to rescue us from the coming wrath. Okay, and so that must be prior to the breaking of the first seal. And so the rapture could literally happen at any moment, whereas the second coming is a definite reappearing of Christ on earth, back to Petra or Bozrah. That's something separate to the rapture.
Okay, brilliant. Let's go on. So we've got the next question is, who are the 144,000 mentioned in the book of Revelation, and what is their significance?
Okay, so these are 144,000 Jewish men who are virgins, and God, by his grace and election, saves them. And I believe he sends these out into the world as preachers of the gospel. This is why, once again, in Matthew 24, we always come back to Matthew 24 with Revelation. Jesus said, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached to all nations, and then the end will come. It will be the 144,000 Jewish evangelists that preach the gospel to the whole earth, and then Christ will return. That's why in the very next verse, after the sealing of the 144,000, we see that there is a great multitude from every nation, tongue, tribe, and language who are in white robes praising God for his salvation, because God has achieved this great worldwide revival through the 144,000 Jewish evangelists.
That's interesting. It's good to know. And I think it is quite, biblically, it is quite literal, isn't it, that it speaks of it to be the Jewish people at that time that have been sealed by God, that are the 144,000 that preach the gospel, because there's some sort of how do you say it? Some people get that wrong, don't they? And they say that's 144,000 that are just going to heaven for whatever. And you think,
it's
what?
not a cultic group.
Yeah, okay, that's what I'm saying.
What's interesting, notice the church does not do this.
Yeah.
Because the church isn't here. That's why God raises up 144,000 Jewish evangelists.
They've been taken out of it, haven't they?
The church has been raptured.
That's right.
So God now uses Israel to preach the gospel to the world.
Brilliant. And that's when a world revival breaks out, isn't it? And
sure.
Brilliant. Yeah, okay. Let's move on then, because I know time's short. So we'll move on to the next question is, what is the role of the angels and the dragon in the book of Revelation, and what do they symbolise?
Okay, so the angels are servants of God, and they are used by God to bring about God's wrath and God's justice upon that planet during those 7-year period. The dragon, of course, is symbolic of Satan, the ancient serpent, the old deceiver, and his goal in the final 3.5 years of the day of the Lord is to wipe out Israel, is to kill the Jewish people. And we will see that because he chases after the woman who is clothed in the sun, standing upon the moon with the 12 stars around her head. This symbolizes Israel. And Satan wants to wipe out Israel because Jesus says in Matthew 23, one chapter before the Olivet Discourse, "You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" And this is a messianic greeting taken from Psalm 118. And Israel were to say this about the coming Messiah. Of course, they've rejected Jesus in the Gospels, and Jesus now speaking to Israel says, "You're not going to see me again until you acknowledge me as your Messiah." And so that's why in the book of Revelation, when Satan knows that his time is short, who does he go after? He doesn't go after Christians. He goes after Israel. Because if he can kill Israel, if he can wipe the Jewish people off the face of this planet, there'll be no one left to look into the one they pierced and to say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord."
Yeah, great. Okay, right, we're going to move on to the next question. How does the book of Revelation interpret the end of the age and the second coming of Christ?
As just mentioned, it needs saved Israel. Paul talks about this in Romans 11. He talks about all Israel being saved. In the future, there'll be a generation of Jewish people, every one of them will have the Holy Spirit of God poured out upon them, as we see in Joel chapter 2, and all Israel will be regenerated and saved. And the main body of Israel at this time will be located in Petra or Bozrah in the modern state of Jordan. And Zechariah 12 tells us they'll look into the one they pierced, they'll mourn for him as they mourn for an only son. And when this occurs, Christ will return to Bozrah to protect Israel against the armies of the Antichrist. He will then march northward, pushing the armies into the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And as we see in Zechariah 14, as they're standing, the very flesh on their bones will rot as Christ speaks the word of God to them, and he overthrows the armies of the Antichrist as well as the Antichrist and the false prophet himself.
Wonderful, that's great. Okay, I'm going to move on because time is escaping us, so I just want to finish these last two questions. How does the book of Revelation depict the final judgment and what happens to the souls of the dead?
Okay, so the final judgment is called the Great White Throne Judgment, and this occurs after the Messianic Kingdom. It's 1,000 years of Christ reigning on earth. After that period of time, Jesus will resurrect all unbelievers into physical resurrected bodies, and they'll be judged at the Great White Throne Judgment. And obviously those who have not accepted Christ will be cast alive into the lake of fire.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Pastor Paul. That's excellent answers. Lovely to be here. We thank you, audience, and we'll see you all again soon. God bless. Take care. Bye.